My timer has already begun. So come on in. If you don't have a handout, there is a handout right over in the corner. And this is a two-part lecture, but they stand on their own. So today I'm going to talk about courage in the Iliad. We're just going to look at the Iliad today. And in the handout, I've given you the book and line numbers if you want to look it up later. And whenever I give a speech for ACCS, I always wanted to have something pedagogical. But this one is particularly good if you teach the Iliad or Odyssey in your school. It will give you like real specific things you can use if you want. So today will be courage in just the Iliad, and then tomorrow we're going to look at justice in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. And actually the handout has both handouts. We're going to look at the one on courage, but the one in the back is for justice. So if you come again tomorrow, bring that as well. Before I started, I just had to give a shout out. There is this awesome guy named Jesse who is the medieval map maker. So make sure you check out his booth. And he does these hand-drawn things. He gave this to me. It's the Iliad showing where all the soldiers were. He's also... He's got the most amazing... This guy's cool. He's got one that traces the journeys of Odysseus. He's got another one that traces the journey of Aeneas. And there's everything. But anyway, check him out, the medieval map maker. Okay. Unlike the Odyssey, which is a melodrama, and we'll talk about the Odyssey tomorrow. In a melodrama, the good guys are good and the bad guys are bad. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. But the Iliad is not like that. The Iliad is unbelievably complex in an ethical way. I want you to think about it. The Iliad is the most pro-war book ever written. No book has ever glorified the battlefield where men win glory the way the Iliad has. And yet, at the exact same time, the Iliad is the most anti-war book ever written, because the Iliad shows us the casualties of war. We see the people who suffer because of this war. We see the death. And so Homer holds them in tension. Achilles is the greatest soldier of all literature. There is no greater soldier than Achilles. And yet, in Book 9 of the Iliad, which we'll look at today, he literally becomes the first pacifist in literature or history. That's crazy. If you've seen any war movie or any Western or read them, you know that our hero, Achilles, sooner or later, he's going to have to fight Hector, who is the greatest soldier of the Trojans. And we know, because we're on the side of the Greeks, that Achilles is going to have to kill Hector. We know that. I'm not giving you spoilers. You know that has to happen. So if I was a lesser poet, I would depict Troy, the enemy, as a sort of armed camp, and Hector as brutal. Maybe he is the predator of ancient Troy or something, right? Because we don't want to feel bad when Hector dies, but we feel really, really bad when he dies, right? So this is a complex epic, and it gives us two very different heroes, Achilles, the greatest soldier on the Greek side, and that's who the epic is about. But just as important is Hector, the antagonist, the greatest hero on the Trojan side. And in these two, we see two different but complementary embodiments of courage, of what it means to have courage. So we're going to start with Hector, and we're going to just confine ourselves to Book 6. And then as much time as I have, we'll look at Achilles in Book 9 to see a different kind of courage and heroism. Now, if you know the Iliad, in Book 5 of the Iliad, Diomedes has his moment of glory, his Aristeia, they called it. And he is on a roll, killing Trojans left and right. It's looking really bad. And so in the beginning of Book 6, Hector decides that he needs to go inside the walls of Troy to do three things. First, he visits his mother to tell her, "Mother, you must take a robe and take it to the roof and sacrifice it to Athena. Maybe she will have mercy upon us," which she doesn't. Then he has to go in because his brother Paris, that good-for-nothing guy who was fighting a duel with Menelaus, and as he was about to lose, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, pulled him away and took him to the bed of Helen, right? And he's been sitting there doing nothing. The war is being fought over him, but Paris is doing nothing. And so the second reason that Hector goes into the city is to visit his brother, and he also meets Helen, but to tell Paris to get off his butt and get back. But what I'm going to focus on is the third reason, right? First, he meets his mother. Then he meets basically his sister, because Helen is now his sister-in-law. But what he really wants to do is meet and say a possible farewell to his beloved Andromache, because he fears he may never see her again. Now, after book 7, everything goes in Hector's favor, but eventually it will go against him, and he will never see Andromache again. The next time Andromache sees him, he will be a corpse. So book 6 shows us the final farewell between these two lovers. And one of the reasons I love to teach my students about Hector and Andromache, and also about Odysseus and Penelope, is one thing that got me really mad in school. And I'm 60 years old. This has been going on for a while. Is when you take classes in public school and they say, now children, of course, in the past, by which they mean 30 years ago, in the past, all men looked upon their wives as cattle. Okay, now first of all, they were talking about my grandma, and I wasn't too happy about that. But second of all, it's nonsense. Will you just read the Iliad and see the incredible love and intimacy between a husband and wife who were probably in arranged marriage and yet love each other, right? And the farewell of Hector and Andromache is one of the most human passages in all of ancient literature, if not all of literature. And suddenly you understand, guess what? There were men who loved their wives back then. There were also men who were cruel back then, just like there are today, right? So we have to get out of this chronological snobbery and see these people as they are. Now, after he sees his mother and he sees Paris and Helen, now he wants to go to his wife Andromache. So naturally, he looks for her in the domestic area. But she's not there, because she's gone up to the watchtower where all the men, mostly the old men, are watching the battle. And she's gone up there because she's worried. And then what happens is, when they realize there's nobody there, they turn around and they meet in the middle. They meet by the gates of Troy in a threshold place, a liminal space, if you want to be fancy. And that's where they have this dialogue in a sort of no man's land. And they speak. And Andromache begs him, please, Hector, stay, don't go back, because Hector, you are everything. You are father and mother and brother, everything to me. Because you see, on the Greek side, even though Achilles is the greatest warrior, when Achilles is not there, they still have Ajax, they still have Diomedes, they still have Agamemnon, they still have Odysseus. They have a lot of great warriors. But on the Trojan side, I mean, they got Sarpedon, they got Glaucon, they got Aeneas, but nobody is on the level of Hector. Hector is the one who is holding together the Trojans. And if he dies, that will be the end. That will be the unraveling of Troy. So everything is resting upon his shoulders. And Hector, in some ways, is the first example in history of the good enemy. What I mean by that is, the Greeks are terrified of him, but they respect him at the same time. He's the good enemy. He's courageous. An example of that would be the way the Romans looked at Hannibal. They were terrified of him, but they respected him as one of the greatest generals of all time. That's also the case during the Crusades, right? The Crusaders were terrified of Saladin, but they respected him as a man of courage and honor. And Dante puts Saladin with the virtuous pagans. There really shouldn't be any virtuous pagans after Jesus, but he's got a few, and one of them is Saladin, right? Now, to come here, because we are in Atlanta, okay, the good enemy, from the Yankee point, I grew up as a Yankee, sorry, is Robert E. Lee, okay? Robert E. Lee, even though the North was terrified of him, they respected him as a man of courage and honor. And the way they've torn down him, it's like we've completely lost any understanding of what honor and courage mean, okay? Because I think the closest person to Hector would actually be Robert E. Lee. By the end of the Civil War, it was like they were fighting for Robert E. Lee, because he embodied everything that was good about the South. There were a lot of bad things, okay? But he embodied everything that was good about the South. That's what Hector's like, okay? And here, again, in this liminal space, they're talking to each other, and he has to explain to his wife why he must return to the battlefield. Now, don't be confused. This is an unbelievably difficult choice for Hector to make. He absolutely loves and is devoted to the army. He is the prince, he's the royal, prince-elect, so to speak, and crown prince. But he also loves his wife and his son. And this is a difficult, difficult choice. And we watch him in this moment of crisis. Now, I suppose he could have just run off to China, like Americans running off to Canada, but I don't think Hector could even conceive of that. He's the kind of person that I'm either going to go on the battlefield and fight, or I'm going to stay here with my family. And in the end, he's going to choose to fight, but it is difficult. Now, one of the ways I help to explain to my college, mostly college sophomores, the way I try to explain Hector and what it means to be a hero, right? This is like my image or picture of the hero. Imagine, you think of Vitruvian Man from Da Vinci, right? Think of a man like this, and around me is a big circle, and I am circumscribed in that circle. Now, on the outside of the circle, imagine a bunch of arrows pressing down on all sides, pushing down, and yet at the same time, imagine inside a bunch of arrows pushing out. And I would argue that it is in the interplay, the struggle between the forces pushing in and the forces pushing out, that we emerge as a hero, as a human being. Now, the outside forces are all of the duties and responsibilities and burdens, all of those things pressing down upon us with their burdens. But in here is our own desire, our own individualism, our own free will, whatever. And it is in that interplay that we emerge as human. And if you're wondering where I got that image from, I actually got it from a verse in the Bible, I put it in your handout, that some of you will recognize, and it's something that St. Paul says. He says, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed." Right? So it is in that interplay where we become. Now, some people might say, well, why don't you just step outside of the circle? Well, you could do that, but when you do that, you not only cease to be a hero, you cease to be a human being. Some of you that study this stuff, and you know you're Carl Truman and stuff, this is often called the autonomous individual. I don't want any strings. I am who I am. I create myself. I define myself, and that's it. Doing that is a kind of human suicide. You cease to be who you are. We are defined in that interplay, and we can see it in Hector as he struggles what to do. Look what he says to his wife. This is book 6. I'm reading from Lattimore, but you can look up the line numbers. And I'm going to look at basically 3 pages of poetry, but it all comes together. It says, "Then tall Hector of the shining helm answered Andromache, 'All these things are in my mind also, lady. Yet I would feel deep shame before the Trojans and the Trojan women with trailing garments, if like a coward I were to shrink aside from the fighting. And the Spirit will not let me, since I have learned to be valiant and to fight always among the foremost ranks of the Trojans, winning for my own self great glory and for my father.'" Here is someone that feels the burden of responsibility, but stands up within it. I know this is crushing me, but I could not live with myself. I would feel ashamed. I could not face the Trojans or the Trojan women if I shrunk away like a coward. Now, to help myself and my students understand the nature of these burdens, I just came up with my own lingo, and I call it the burden of the past, the burden of the present, and the burden of the future. Now, what do I mean by that? any of you who have read any of the Iliad or the Odyssey, even if you've only read a little bit, you will recognize immediately that you almost never see a name of a hero just naked, right? There's always two things attached to the name of the hero. One thing is what's called a patronymic, which is Greek for father's name, because every word is Greek. So there you go. All right. So patronymic means your father's name. So Achilles, son of Peleus. Agamemnon, son of Atreus. Hector, son of Priam. I want you to think what it would be like for you in the audience if you were continually known by your father or mother's name. Not, your name, but son of or daughter of so-and-so. Would that put a little bit of pressure on you? The pressure to live up to your parents' reputation? Now, that would be the most obvious if, like, your father and grandfather were all military, right? But it didn't make a difference. Maybe your mom is the hostess of the entire city, okay? That's a pressure, too. It's a pressure to live up to the reputation of your parents. And Hector continually feels that pressure because he is the son of King Priam, one of the greatest kings in ancient literature, wise and good, and he has got to live up to that. And because his father is too old to fight, he also needs to lead the armies. Right? So he continually feels that pressure, and he tries to explain it to his wife Andromache in very tender terms. So that's what I call the burden of the past, living up. And some of you might have felt this way if you had an older sibling who was like a straight A student, and then you come along and all of your teachers expect you to be just as good as your brother or sister. You ever feel that pressure? Okay, that's also kind of a burden of the past. In a traditional society, we have to live up to the reputation of our ancestors. So it takes courage to bear that burden, not to just throw it off, right? Now, I used another phrase I call the burden of the present. All right, there's actually two things attached to their names. There is Achilles, son of Peleus, but he's also called what Achilles? You all know it. Swift-footed Achilles. Hector, tamer of horses. Goodly Agamemnon. Menelaus, good at the war cry. There's a word for this. The Greeks called it an epithet. It's like a 2-3 word sort of adjective clause that describes the hero. And a lot of times it will be swift-footed Achilles, son of Peleus. That could be a whole line of poetry, just stretched out with the patronymic and the epithet. Now, I call that the burden of the present because not only does Hector feel the need to live up to his father's reputation, he has to live up to whose reputation? His own reputation, okay? How many, look, I don't care how old you were students once, okay? How many of you had those parents, right? In high school, you were in the top 10% of your class. And so your parents expect that when you go to college, you will continue to be in the top 10% of your class. Vainly, you try to teach your parents math and statistics. If everybody in this university was in the top 10% of their high school, they can all not remain in the top 10%, right? But there is this burden to live. So if you're swift-footed Achilles, you better not slow down, right? So again, Hector feels the weight and burden of this. And I like to say that when he says those words I read, when he says, since I have learned to be valiant and to fight always among the foremost ranks of the Trojans, winning for my own self great glory and for my father. I'm holding up my hand because it sounds like a Boy Scout oath. And I'm saying that as a good way, right? He has this oath. We have any Eagle Scouts? My son's an Eagle Scout. Boaz, you should be an Eagle Scout. Man, you guys, come on. It's too late now. You're past 18. You can't do it anymore, right? Go out. You'll be a life for life or something like that, right? So, now, what do I mean by the burden of the future? All right, let me read the rest of his little speech to Andromache and see if there's something here that you might think of calling burden of the future. For I know this thing well in my heart, and my mind knows it. There will come a day when sacred Ilion shall perish, and Priam, and the people of Priam, of the strong ash spear. But it is not so much the pain to come of the Trojans that troubles me, not even of Priam the king, nor Hecuba, not the thought of my brothers, who in their numbers and valor shall drop in the dust under the hands of men who hate them, as troubles me the thought of you, when some bronze-armored Achaean leads you off, taking away your day of liberty in tears. And in Argos you must work at the loom of another, and carry water from the spring, Messias or Hyperia, all unwilling, but strong will be the necessity upon you. And someday, seeing you shedding tears, a man will say of you, this is the wife of Hector, who was ever the bravest fighter of the Trojans, breaker of horses in the days when they fought about Ilion. So will one speak of you, and for you it will be yet a fresh grief to be widowed of such a man who could fight off the day of your slavery. But may I be dead and the piled earth hide me under before I hear you crying, and know by this that they drag you captive. I wonder if any of you noticed something that you might call the burden of the future. Not only does he feel the weight of living up to his father's reputation and living up to his own reputation, he is actually conscious of what people will say about him after he dies. He does this a lot. The Greeks do it all the time, imagining what people will say about them 30 years from now. That is how much of a burden and how much courage it takes to bear that burden, not to shove it off, but to hold on to it and to even be defined by it and not try to escape from under it. You resist with your own sense of yourself, but you don't do that by throwing off the responsibility that's been laid upon you. And this is a problem in our modern society. Now, how many of you remember when you were a kid reading Tom Sawyer? Have you ever read Tom Sawyer? Do you remember that Huck and Tom get to be witnesses at their own what? Funeral. Remember, everybody thinks they're dead in the boat. And how many of you would like to go to your own funeral? You want to know what people really think about you. Yeah, that means you're an English major at heart, if that's what you want, right? And of course, if you don't know it, they're saying all these nice things, and the boys start crying, and they're actually caught by it. And then, of course, they want to beat them, but then they're happy they're there. You know that whole thing. There's a lot of parents in this room. You know what I'm talking about, right? But again, so Hector is the hero that feels pressed in on every side, and will he be able to bear it? Now, at this point, Hector reaches out for his son. He has a small baby named Astyanax, which means Lord of the City, though Homer tells us that his name for his son is Scamandrios, because Scamander is the river that flows through his beloved city of Troy. It would be as if a Londoner called his daughter Temi after the Thames, right? So it's an affectionate term. And there is the mother, and there's also a nurse holding the baby, and Hector reaches out for the baby. Look what happens. So speaking, glorious Hector held out his arms to his baby, who shrank back to his fair girdled nurse's bosom, screaming, and frightened at the aspect of his own father, terrified as he saw the bronze and the crest with its horsehair nodding dreadfully as he thought from the peak of the helmet. Then his beloved father laughed out, and his honored mother, and at once glorious Hector lifted from his head the helmet and laid it in all its shining upon the ground. Then, taking up his dear son, he tossed him about in his arms and kissed him, and lifted his voice in prayer to Zeus and the other immortals. Zeus and you other immortals, grant that this boy who is my son may be as I am, preeminent among the Trojans, great in strength as am I, and rule strongly over Ilion. And someday let them say of him, he is better by far than his father, as he comes in from the fighting, and let him kill his enemy, and bring home the blooded spoils, and delight the heart of his mother. Now, I'm quite sure that there are many mothers in this room who are thinking, that would not delight my heart very much, okay? But it's a different world, okay? It's kind of like your cat bringing back a dead bird for you, right? They're doing it out of love. You don't want to see it. But anyway, so this is remarkable, right? He picks up the baby, but he's wearing one of those helmets. You know, when I was younger, all these guys had that stupid mohawk. People seem to have outgrown that now. They just tattoo their body instead. But anyway, at least the mohawk could be cut off. But anyway, so it's got that big horsehair, and the child is terrified of it. And what does the great soldier, eager to go back to battle, He stops and he removes his helmet. Humanizing one, picks up the boy, throws him up and down, laughing, begging the gods to show favor upon his son. This is the way I felt when that football player spoke at that Catholic graduation. You all saw that, okay? Only in America do you ask somebody, so would you like your daughter to marry a man who is a great athlete and very wealthy and very strong and wants to allow his wife to be a full-time mom? No, I wouldn't want my daughter. We've lost our minds, basically. America's lost his mind, okay? This is Hector, okay, who is strong and brave, but there's a tenderness there as he takes the time to embrace his son. And then again, just get out of your mind this idea that all men thought their wives were cattle, because it says, so speaking, he set his child again in the arms of his beloved wife, who took him back again to her fragrant bosom, smiling in her tears. And her husband saw and took pity upon her and stroked her with his hand and called her by name and spoke to her. How tender he is. He doesn't say, I'm gone, woman, okay? He takes the time to explain to her why he must do the duty that has been laid upon him, right? So this is a multifaceted kind of courage. And I like to teach my students, okay, you all have seen WWJD, right? The bracelet, which stands for What Would Jesus Do? I want my students to ask that, but I also want them to ask, what would Achilles do? What would Hector do? What would Antigone do? What would Oedipus do? Don't do that, please. All right? So I also want them to think about that, right? I want them, and there was a great thinker named Kenneth Burke, and he wrote an essay a long time ago called Literature as Equipment for Living. And I read it when I was in graduate school. And he said that great literature gives us equipment or strategies for dealing with difficult situations. I want my students to study what I call the microcosm of the Iliad. Study the world of the Iliad, how it works, what it values, and ask yourself, what does it take to be a hero in this world? Or what does it take to be a villain? Right? You don't want to do that. And so we need to look at these heroes and evaluate them, and we can actually learn from them. Because all of us will be in moments of crisis where we are what they call on the horns of a dilemma. And that means whichever one we choose, there's going to be good and bad. It's not clean cut, right? Lots of times in life, there's not a simple answer of what's right and what's wrong. And so here he is trying to make a difficult decision. And he is going to explain to Andromache, in just a few lines of poetry, two of the strategies he has adopted to make sense out of this world gone mad. It's these strategies that gives him the courage to stay true to his calling. So let's take them one at a time. Each is only 4 lines long. Let's start with this. Poor Andromache, why does your heart sorrow so much for me? No man is going to hurl me to Hades unless it is fated. But as for fate, I think that no man yet has escaped it. Once it has taken its first form, neither brave man nor coward. Now, what Homer and Hector are articulating here is the concept of the death day. That God or the gods have determined the day that you will die, and you cannot escape that, whatever you do. Now, there are probably some good Calvinists in the room that believe that. But that's not really a biblical teaching, okay? I mean, God is sovereign, but nowhere in the Bible that I've chosen the exact day that you're going to die and you can't escape it, okay? And certainly the Bible doesn't want us to look for a fortune teller to tell us when that day is. But you know what, folks? There actually is a religion that believes that we have a death day, and that religion is called Islam. If you read the Quran, it says many times that Allah, God, has appointed the day you will die, and you can't escape it. In fact, there's a scene in the Quran where there is a cemetery, and the souls of the dead underneath are crying out to God. It's a battlefield, and they're saying, if we had any say in the matter, we wouldn't be lying here. And God says, you fools, even if you stayed home, you would have died on this appointed day. For Allah, again, God is in control, but we have to be careful as Christians not to become fatalists. Because Christianity is not a fatalistic religion. But here, Hector's falling back on a little bit of fatalism and saying, look, since I cannot escape my death, let me at least do my duty as I see it and help as much as I can. Because I can't escape the death. It will come to me no matter what I do. So that idea of the death day, of fate, is a way of helping to deal with the vagaries of life. And again, to keep us brave and courageous. Let's look at the second one. This one would be more controversial. Not in this room, but if I was speaking to a bunch of PhDs, they would be throwing things at me. All right, he says to her, here's another strategy. Go therefore back to our house and take up your own work, the loom and the distaff, and see to it that your handmaidens ply their work also. But the men must see to the fighting, all men who are the people of Ilion, but I beyond others. Now, what we talk about here, and this was understood until recently, is the idea of the two spheres, of the husband in the military sphere or the business sphere, whatever it is, and the wife in the domestic sphere. And you have to understand that in this civilization, both of those spheres are respected. And by the way, they are respected in most Muslim countries, okay? We get to hear about honor killings and stuff like that, but that is really not the majority. I would say most Muslim men I know respect their wives as wives more than most American men do, okay? So, I mean, I don't want to, I work with Christians and Muslims all the time. So this is, let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about, okay? This is an American folly. Have you ever been at church and Mother's Day, and your preacher wants to help out the ladies? So he gives a sermon in which he says, now, if you take all the things that a homemaker does, right, and you assign a value to how much it would cost to have somebody from the outside do that, and you add it up, it's like she's making, I don't know, $70,000 a year. Now, the man who says that is well-meaning, okay? But he's sadly mistaken, because he has embodied the whole problem. And that's the problem that says something is only valuable if it has a monetary value to it. That's the whole thing that got us in all of these problems, okay? When we stopped valuing the work as work and its necessity for the flourishing of a family and the human race. So here, this is not a man saying, woman, go back to the kitchen and stay barefoot and pregnant, okay? This is, if we want to hold together this world that's falling apart, we must do our duty. And if you've read Homer carefully, you know what the wife's duty is? She's always at the loom, right? She is making clothes. There are girls today who are like, oh, my hobby is sewing. But you know what that is? You go out and buy these big pieces of cloth and sew them together, right? This is the day when you have to make your own thread, okay? So it is a full-time job. And a noble woman like Andromache or Helen or somebody would not only be working at the loom, she would be a sort of, what do you want to say, floor manager, having all the other women working at the loom underneath her, right? By the way, is there a place in the Bible where we see a woman working at the loom? Proverbs 31, the Proverbs 31 wife, as David Noble, who started Summit Ministries, like to say, it takes one chapter of Proverbs to straighten out the wives and the other 30 to straighten out the guys, they like to say. But this is work that is valued. The first time we see Helen, she is making a beautiful tapestry, and she's weaving into it the battle of the Trojan War that's being fought over her. But she's trying to take the horror and the death and making it into something beautiful. So what Hector is doing here is saying, look, the way we bring order to our world is by doing our duty, right? What is the one part of Hinduism that really freaks out Americans? It's called the what system? The caste system, okay? Nothing that seems more un-American than that, okay? That whole idea is based on the Hindu notion of dharma. Dharma is the word for the Sanskrit word for duty. And there's a famous work called the Bhagavad Gita that's all about duty, doing your duty. Now, I'm glad we don't have a caste system, okay? But we have to be careful we don't go to the opposite extreme, right? I'm glad that we don't have to do exactly the same thing our parents did. But sometimes we go to the other extreme of casting out all responsibility together. We are not radical individuals. We are part of a community. I'd like to tell the ladies in my class, you know what your first job will be when you marry your husband? Your first job will be to memorize all the birth dates and anniversary dates of your husband's family. Any women understand what I'm talking about? God forbid the man understands, okay? Because, but the woman understands that this is important, right? Keeping these ties is important, right? And has to keep reminding the husband that he's not just a radical individual, but he's somebody's son, somebody's husband, somebody's father, and somebody's brother, right? Now, I'll tell you something funny. I've only seen one exception to the rule, and my school, one of my colleagues, is a white woman, but her husband is Mexican. And even though she's the woman, he's the man, he's Mexican, and so he has to remind her every day, did you talk to your mother today, okay? Because one thing that I'm hoping, because we have a lot of Latinos in Houston, I tell them, I say, your job is to seek out the American dream, but don't sacrifice your family to do it. That's the mistake that a lot of white people have made, okay? Don't make that sacrifice. Understand. So what I'm getting at here is that this kind of courage values the battlefield, but it also values doing your duty within society, within community. You know, it was such a terrible thing when Hillary Clinton, whenever it was, 15 years ago, said, it takes a village to raise a child. What she said is absolutely true. It's an African. Unfortunately, it's not what she meant. She meant it takes the government to raise a child, okay? But it's actually true that it takes a community to raise a child, right? And I think we would have less divorces today if we had a better community. Because when the wife is sick and tired, she goes to her female friends and they complain about men, and we go and complain. And that's actually healthy, okay? As long as you don't kill each other. It's actually healthy because we can get her. God did not mean us to be this isolated couple. One of the things I tell my students all the time whenever I can get a chance, because I was fooled too growing up in the evangelical world. In the evangelical world, we've been taught that God has one man or woman for you, and you've got to find her. There's a soulmate out there. That sounds really romantic, but it's completely unbiblical. It comes from Aristophanes, a Greek comic playwright, okay? Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't marry your best friend, okay? The trouble is, all these people have this idea, if I find my soulmate, then we will be everything to each other and we won't need anybody else. That's not true. Man has to maintain his male friends. Woman has to maintain her female friends. They need to work together. This, I'm trying to get you, Hector's courage is on the battlefield, but it's also the courage of being the glue that not only holds together his family, but all of Troy. And we need to be reminded of that. There's a fun movie on I think it's on HBO Max called The Blue Beetle. It's the first Hispanic superhero. And it's really funny because it's different than the other ones because his family is involved in everything, okay? And in fact, when he first turns into the Blue Beetle, his whole family's there. And when they asked the writer, why did you do that? He said, this is a Mexican family. They would have found that anyway. So what that, but again, what I'm getting at, and I tell my students, I say, look, I may be European, but I'm a Greek. Greeks are much more like Latinos than they are like British or French or something like that, okay? We're hot-blooded. We live by the Mediterranean, okay? So part of the courage is holding together our community. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about Achilles. Because, oddly enough, just as Hector shows his courage in staying absolutely true to the mores of his society, Achilles shows his courage, oddly, by breaking from those rules and standards. It's a crazy. Let me try to, I got 20 minutes, let me see if I can do it. Okay, now, after book 6, Hector starts going on the roll, and he is winning, and by book 8, the Trojans have completely swamped the Greeks. They're even threatening to take their ships and burn them, right? Now, if you know the Iliad, in book 1 of the Iliad, Agamemnon had stolen Achilles' war prize, and in anger, Achilles had pulled out. And between book 1 and book 9, we haven't even seen him. He's not fighting at all. Well, by the time we get to the end of book 8, Agamemnon realizes we can't get by without this guy. It's bigger than that. He made a prayer to Zeus. We won't go into that. But he's like, you know what? We need Achilles back because we're in big trouble. So Agamemnon puts together a deputation of 3 people. Odysseus, who of course is very wily, Ajax, who's the second strongest warrior after Achilles, and a character that I believe Homer invented. I don't even think it's in the oral tradition. I think Homer invented. His name is Phoenix, and he was the tutor of Achilles when he was a boy. And so those of you know ethos, pathos, logos, all of them are appealing to all parts of Achilles. And with them, Agamemnon sends a ransom, an extremely noble ransom to allow him to come back in. Now, everybody expects that Achilles will accept the ransom and come back, because that's just what you do. But he doesn't do it. So in the time left, I'm going to talk about why everybody expects him to accept it and why he doesn't, right? And why he's got this strange, different kind of courage to do it. Now, why do these soldiers fight? Do you think they really care that Menelaus can't keep a hand on his wife? Really? Okay. All the Romans, all the Athenians, the Greeks and the Trojans both are fighting for prizes. Okay. Our culture is one that values money, right? Those who have the most money are on the top. And one good thing about that is, if I ask you who's the richest person, you can figure it out. You could look at it, you can add it up, right? But the Iliad takes place in an honor society. Those who have the most honor are the alpha males on the top of society, right? So, how do you determine who has the most honor? It's not like counting chairs or measuring ceilings. How do you figure out who has the most honor? Well, they had a system, and it's all there in Homer, but you have to piece it together. He has the most honor who has the most meeds of honor. A meed of honor, M-E-E-D, a meed of honor are the war prizes that they win. And the war prizes can be horses, it can be gold, it can be weapons, and yes, it can be captive women as well. So when Agamemnon steals away Achilles' captive woman, he is literally stealing his honor, right? And so the whole point is, we are fighting for honor because, look, we're all mortal. We're all going to die, right? So let's at least die with honor. And he who has the most meeds of honor when he dies has the most honor. Now, I know that's weird to Americans, because it sounds like I'm saying to you, he who has the most stuff when he dies wins. That's not what I'm talking about, okay? I'm talking about something that is not just valued for its monetary value. It's valued because it's an embodiment of honor. Look, how many of you had a mother or grandmother that has this incredibly expensive fine china? What? People still do that? Okay. How many of you girls, your mother said, when I'm gone, I'm going to pass this down to you. And you're like, I really don't care. Now, some of you do. They're classical, so maybe you do, okay? But certainly the age of my kids, if you're 20, they're like, what? I eat off paper plates, man. I'm not going to do the dishes, okay? But you understand that the value of that is like, mom is never going to sell the china, okay? It shows the value of the house, like the fine silver and all of those things are, it's not materialism in the way we normally think about it. This shows the wealth of the house. And that's the closest way I can explain the way that they feel. That's why you fight, okay? He who has the most meeds of honor wins. Now, the ransom that Agamemnon offers him is more meeds of honor than anybody has ever been offered. It goes on for 2 pages and it's repeated, right? And if Achilles accepts it, he will immediately be the most honorable soldier that ever lived, right? So it is inconceivable that, most of my students don't even know what the Princess Bride is. But anyway, it is inconceivable that Achilles would not accept it and go back. It's not a bribe in the way we think of it. It's a way of offering something that will show forth the honor of Achilles. And it's a legitimate offer. And Achilles should take it. But he doesn't. It's one of the craziest things in Book 9 of the Iliad. Now, why? Well, my theory, Homer doesn't exactly tell us, but I want you to think about the battlefield, right? Up until Book 1 of the Iliad, where do you think Achilles would have been on the battlefield? right dead in the center, killing back. You understand that Achilles is about 19 or 20 years old. We kind of forget that. Patroclus is actually older than Achilles. It's only one verse that tells you that, but it's there. Achilles is a young man, probably 19, in fact. Okay, and he has literally grown up on the battlefield. He has never known anything other than fighting on the battlefield. That winning meeds of honor, that has been his entire life. And now, for the first time in his life, if this is the battlefield, Achilles is over here, outside watching. Can you imagine if you were like the star football player in high school, and then your senior year, you broke your leg, and you had to sit in the bleachers and watch everybody else play? You might start thinking things like you never thought before, like, is this really that important? Does this really, or think if you're like the cheerleader, the head cheerleader, right? You are Miss School Spirit, rah, 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 and then you break your leg, and you got to watch all the other girls. It's like, maybe this is not so important. Maybe there's more to me than rah, 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 okay? I'm not making fun of those things. That's pretty cool. My mother twirled a baton in Mitchell, South Dakota 80 years ago, right? Me, right? The modern-day gymnast is actually, the modern-day cheerleader is a gymnast disguised as a cheerleader. Right? It's insane. Okay. Anyway, so you would start asking yourself questions, maybe big questions like, who am I? Why am I here? What is my purpose? How do I know I'm of value? When you're caught up in things like that, sports, and it like consumes you. And all of a sudden, you got to stop and look. And it's clear that he's been thinking, right? La fou, I'm afraid I've been thinking. A dangerous business, I know. Okay, you at least know that from Beauty and the Beast. So this is not something that he's good at normally, okay? But he's clearly been thinking. I'm going to prove to you that he's been thinking. Because after Odysseus comes in and lays out all the offer, okay, the whole thing, including returning the captive girl with a pledge that Agamemnon has not slept with her, because you want to sleep with a girl after Brad Pitt has slept with her? Okay, you have to think if you get that joke. Okay, so it's from the movie Troy. Okay, and he's also going to give Achilles one of his own daughters as a wife, whoever he wants, and bounds all sorts of things, right? And after he finishes, Achilles speaks and gives the second longest speech in the entire Iliad, which is strange because Achilles is an actor, not a speaker. And this is what he says in book 9. And I guess I've got the line numbers for you if you want to look it up later. And those are the line numbers in Greek, so it'll help you find it, right? Because Lattimore is line for line. That's what's nice about Lattimore, it's line for line. Okay, so he says, okay, this is so amazing. I will speak to you the way it seems best to me. Neither do I think the son of Atreus, Agamemnon, will persuade me, nor the rest of the Greeks, since there was no gratitude given for fighting incessantly forever against your enemies. Now, if Achilles stopped there, I would be like, well, he's just sore, right? He's bitter. We can understand that. But the next thing he says is totally different, and it's like nothing else in ancient literature, before maybe Plato. He says, fate is the same for the man who holds back, the same if he fights hard. We are all held in a single honor, the brave with the weaklings. A man dies still if he has done nothing, as one who has done much. Now, I would hope that most of us would agree with that sentiment. But what he's saying is, again, look, you know what this is like? Imagine if you were a little pipsqueak of a guy, and you're like a high school junior, and you're a little pip, and you come forward and say, oh, sports is stupid. We shouldn't do sports. Nobody cares about sports. You're going to take that guy seriously? Okay, right? Yeah, you're jealous. But imagine if the head, the quarterback that everybody loves, and he comes forward and says, I've been thinking about it, and maybe sports is not the most important thing in life. Don't you think your ears would prick up? Why is this guy saying this? Okay, Achilles is the poster boy for the Medes of honor system. Few people have benefited more than Achilles, who has all the great prizes, all the glory, everybody knows he's the best. That's why Agamemnon is hard, because everybody knows that Achilles is the best. Agamemnon knows Achilles is the best, right? And now he's saying Whether you're brave or a weakling, you get the same honor? This is crazy. He's suggesting something radically new. He doesn't quite know what to do with it, okay? But he's suggesting maybe honor is somehow deeper or more essential or more intrinsic. Maybe it's not just about how well you fight in the battlefield. What is he saying? He's going to tear down the very system that benefits him. What is that all about? Okay. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on and he starts complaining, right? But then he comes back to it and says, even more shockingly, for not worth the value of my life are all the possessions they fable were won for Ilion, that strong-founded citadel in the old days when there was peace before the coming of the sons of the Achaeans. Again, for not worth the value of my life are all the possessions they fable. Excuse me, I think he just said you can't put a price tag on a human life. And again, I hope not everyone in the world believes that, by the way, okay? But we believe it in our country, I think, okay? But not here. Yes, you can actually put a price tag, okay? If I kill your brother, you'll forgive me if I give you a blood price for him, right? A noble enough blood price, then this is a line from the Iliad, by the way, then you can just sit there and nobody's going to bother you because you've made restitution. But what's going on here? He's suggesting a radically new ethic, that maybe there's something deeper than the honor of these things. What's going on? Well, after he says this, just to show you, this is a long speech, I'll just give you two little parts of it. After he finishes, it says, line 430, so he spoke, so Achilles spoke, and all of them stayed stricken to silence in amazement at his words. He had spoken to them very strongly. Deer in the headlights? What are you saying? Inconceivable. And later on, at the end of the book, end of book 9, these three guys go back to Agamemnon, the Greeks, and they tell them what Achilles said, and they all go, the exact same words. They were all stricken to silence. What are you going on? Didn't he listen to Markos' lecture? Don't you know how things work? This is crazy. So now it's time for Phoenix, the tutor, to come. And I told you, I think Homer invents this character. And he comes forward and tries to reason with Achilles, tries to explain to them the way things work. It's like, if the gods are mad at you, you can burn thighs and oxen in their favor, and they will turn away from their wrath. It's a sacrifice, but it's actually a meed of honor for the gods. That's how it works. Come on, right? And then Achilles is still not getting it. So Phoenix does what you do in a traditional society. You tell a story, right? You find a story from the past that is very similar to what's happening now. It's sort of like a lawyer or a judge looking for legal precedent, right? If a judge finds legal precedent and the previous judge said guilty, then the modern judge also going to say guilty or innocent? You also say guilty, right? Because you always follow precedent, unless, of course, you're the Roe versus Wade jury, okay? But other than that, you find, and by the way, how many of you were here 2 years ago when Roe versus Wade went down? Were you here? And George Grant was here, who I guess he was there when it first happened, right? And we got to sing, and Vodi Bakum was here. It was amazing, okay, 2 years ago. All right, so he tells them a story. This is from the oral tradition, but he's using it, of a famous, the Achilles of 100 years earlier, a guy named Meleager, the hero of the Caledonian boar hunt. There are 3 times in ancient Greek literature that all the tough guys get together for one cause. One of them is the Trojan War. Another one is Jason and the Argonauts. And in between those two, Jason is first, in between them is the Caledonian boar hunt. And they all come together. And there's a fight going on. And as long as Meleager is fighting, the other side is losing big time. But then Meleager gets mad. He feels like he's been slighted. And so he pulls out of the war. And immediately his side starts losing. And they're desperate. And so all the elders come together and they beg Meleager to come. They offer him gifts, prizes. They beg him to come back. But he refuses. And then his wife comes to him and says to him what it's like when a culture is destroyed and the people are taken to slavery and people are dead. And the thought of all that blood kind of goes to his head. And Meleager is like, ah! And he goes out and he conquers and he defeats the enemy and his side wins. But what's the moral of the story? Phoenix explains the moral of the story this way. He says, I'm sorry, where is it? It says, got too many notes here. He says, and the heart, as he listened to all this evil, was stirred within him, and he rose and went and clothed his body in shining armor. So he gave way in his own heart and drove back the day of evil from the Aetolians. Yet these no longer would make good their many and gracious gifts, yet he drove back the evil. Sorry, you ever watch late night TV when they're like, and if you buy this right now, you can get it for 50% off, but you got to buy it in the next 5 minutes. And you're like, are they watching me? Okay. So all bets off, man. That's it. And so what's going on? And then he says to him, okay, listen then, Achilles, do not have such a thought in your mind. Let not the spirit within you turn you that way, dear friend. It would be worse to defend the ships after they are burning. No, with gifts promised, go forth. There's a strategy for living. When the means are offered, you do it. Okay? You don't wait around. You take it and you go. And then he says something that, again, should sound strange to our ears. He says, the Achaeans will honor you as they would an immortal. But if without gifts you go into the fighting where men perish, your honor will no longer be as great, though you drive back the battle. Most of us say, look, if he's honorable, he's honorable. But he's saying you can do it all, but if you have no gifts, no means of honor to show forth that glory, then you will actually have less honor. And now Achilles responds, and again says something that's just crazy. Then in answer to him spoke Achilles of the swift feet. Phoenix, my father, aged, illustrious, such honor is a thing I need not. Can you imagine Elon Musk saying, another $1 billion is a thing I need not? You understand? Such honor is a thing I need not. Achilles, the poster boy of all this. Then he says, I think I am honored already in Zeus's ordinance, which will hold me here beside my curved ships as long as life's wind stays in my breast, as long as my knees have their spring beneath me. I know I have value simply because I have breath in my lungs and spring in my knees. I know I am of value in Zeus's aegis simply because I am alive. Now, we live in a Judeo-Christian world where we take for granted that life has intrinsic value. Sometimes we don't act like we believe that, but we're supposed to believe. But here, out of the blue, Achilles is saying this. What's going on, right? Now, here is the great tragedy. Achilles has the courage to step out and suggest a new ethic that says we have intrinsic value merely because we are alive and there is honor deep within us. He has this great idea, but he can't do anything with it because he's got nobody to talk to, right? If we have a new idea, we can bat it back and forth. Everybody thinks he's crazy, right? And guess what? If this idea had come to King Priam or Odysseus or King Nestor, they might have been able to turn it into an ethic. But Achilles is the last person in the world to do it. And here's the tragedy. Because of this new idea, which is so great, and because of his courage to try to come up with a new ethic, he doesn't go back into the war. Instead, he allows Patroclus to wear his armor and go, and Patroclus is killed. And guess what, folks? After Patroclus is killed, Achilles doesn't just give up on this new ethic. He throws it out and goes to the other extreme and becomes a killing machine. And the world is going to have to wait about 700 years for Socrates and Plato, and really wait another 400 for Christ to bring back that ethos or that ethic. But the fact that, it's crazy to me, okay, that even Homer would come up with this. Maybe Homer doesn't understand it, right? But there is this moment of incredible courage to stand out and suggest a new ethic that will, in a way, strip Achilles of his super-duper specialness and bring something to everyone. So it's amazing that in the same book, the Iliad, we have two different concepts of courage, and yet they still complement one another because Hector and Achilles are trying to be true to this ethos. Let me say a quick prayer. Father God, we thank you so much for the legacy of Homer, Lord, a man that did not know Christ, that did not have access to the Old Testament, and yet, Lord, you speak through your general revelation, and you explain things, preparing the heart of Greece and Rome for the coming of the gospel. As Paul said, now therefore what you have worshipped in ignorance, I will proclaim to you as known. Help us, Lord, in our society to have the courage of Hector, to stay within our community and to fight for it and to be responsible. But help us also to have the courage of Achilles, to look forward towards an ethos that is even closer to the good, the true, and the beautiful. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you. We covered a lot. Oh my gosh, I didn't think it was possible.